And now to present today's 2 o'clock program in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're focusing on the theme, the global religious public square. Today's distinguished guest is Karen Armstrong, contemporary and historical religion's most prolific author. Karen Armstrong is a highly sought-after lecturer around the world and called upon by governments, universities, and church and secular organizations alike to educate about the world's religions and to inform regarding their place in the modern world. She's the author of numerous books on religious affairs, including A History of God, The Battle for God, Holy War, Islam, A Short History, The Great Transformation, the Bible, the biography, The Case for God, and most recently, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. She's also written 2 memoirs, Through the Narrow Gate and The Spiral Staircase, my apologies. Her work has been translated into over 50 languages. Her newest book, Fields of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence, will be available this fall. Karen has done much work on the world stage. She's addressed members of the U.S. Congress, lectured to policymakers at the U.S. State and Defense Departments, participated in the World Economic Forum, addressed the Council on Foreign Relations in both Washington and New York, served as an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and speaks regularly in Muslim countries. In 2007, she was awarded a medal by the Egyptian government for her services to Islam under the auspices of the prestigious Al-Azhar Madrasa, the first foreigner to have been awarded this decoration. She was presented with the 4 Freedoms Medal for Freedom of Worship by the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute and the Dr. Leonard Lucas Prize at Tübingen University. A trustee of the British Museum and a fellow of the Royal Academy of Literature, in 2013 she was the inaugural recipient of the British Academy Naif al-Radan Prize for Transcultural Understanding. In 2008, she was awarded the TED Prize for her vision of a charter for compassion, leading thinkers in 6 of the world's religions as a cooperative effort to restore not only compassionate thinking, but more importantly, compassionate action to the center of moral and political life. The charter is now being implemented practically, realistically, and creatively in countries, cities, schools, and religious communities throughout the world. The title of Karen's lecture today, related to her forthcoming book, is Religion and the History of Violence. We're most grateful to the Jim and Lynn Gashi Levinson Fund for Chautauqua, which provides funding for today's lecture. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Karen Armstrong.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. From the book of Genesis. Now, Cain was a tiller of the soil, and Abel a herder of flock. And it came to pass that Cain took his brother out into the field, and he killed him. And Yahweh said, "Where is your brother, Abel?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I the guardian of my brother?" God said, "What have you done? Hark, your brother's blood is crying to me from the soil." Well, here we are again at Chautauqua, a place where we all feel so secure, where we seem to be living according to the norms of what we imagine was a more peaceful bygone days. when people could leave their doors unlatched and children could run around in the streets without fear of molestation or being run over by hideous traffic, and where there's peace and chance for learning and companionship. And I love coming here. It always reminds me, and I know I've said this to you before, of the pleasure park, in which it said that the Buddha's father incarcerated him to prevent him seeing 4 disturbing sights. When the baby was born, when the Buddha was born, his father invited the local priests in to tell his fortune. And they said he'd see 4 very disturbing things that would inspire him to leave home and become a monk, and he'd become an enlightened man, a Buddha. And the Buddha's father wasn't very pleased with this career option. He had more ambitious ideas for his son, so he put him in this pleasure park and posted around the gate, all the grounds, guards that would keep any distressing or disturbing spectacle at bay. Chautauqua is also situated in the United States, another privileged enclave, and I would say exactly the same of Britain, my own country, and where I live in a pretty little street in London. This is privilege beyond belief. And yet, while we sit here, we know, as we look at the news nightly, that there's war and violence and bloodshed right out there. And, for the past 12 years or so, I've been standing right here on this podium and talking about questions of religion and violence, which obviously came to the fore with the terrible atrocity of September the 11th, 2001. We've often had some interesting discussions here, sometimes quite, let me say, abrasive. People make statements quite dogmatically that religion, the favorite one of this, I've not just heard this in Chautauqua, but on the lips of taxi drivers, academics, and psychiatrists. Religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history. An odd remark. The 2 world wars clearly were not caused by religion, but by national fervor. Or they say that monotheism is particularly prone to violence because of its single belief in a single God, or that Islam is a religion that's fanatically intent upon violence and killing. I listen to our politicians discoursing, at least in the UK, discoursing rather loftily on behavior abroad and other people's conflict, as though it were far distant from we ourselves. Now, this is natural because we're living in disturbing times, and it's natural that people feel disturbed. But often people speak as if from a position of unimpeachable righteousness, as though they were not guilty of such crimes themselves. Now, to kill 1 civilian in a terrorist action, let alone nearly 2,000, is a heinous, abhorrent sin against our humanity. There's no doubt about it. But as we deplore it, we should also remember that military historians and terrorist experts tell us that by far the institution most responsible for the killing of most civilians has been the state. During the Second World War, for example, Allied scientists carefully calculated wind patterns to create firestorms which they targeted deliberately on civilian areas in German and Japanese towns, precisely to cause terror among the population. In 1940, I believe these figures are correct. In 1914-18 war, the war we're commemorating right now, only 5% of the number of people who were killed were civilians. In World War II, that went up to 66.5%, and it now stands at 90%. So that as we fight our wars, we must hear God's question to us. Where is your brother? And hark, your brother's blood is crying to me from the soil. Now, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, who is our brother? We have not only do we share a common humanity, but in our time, we have created a global market which has made us more interconnected than ever before in history. We're linked together closely on the World Wide Web. Economically, we are utterly interdependent. When stocks fall in one part of the world, markets plummet all around the globe that day as a result. And what happens in Afghanistan today can have repercussions in New York or London or Madrid tomorrow. And our histories are intertwined. I speak as a British person, and I know how we have affected the lives of millions of people in our former empire, in our colonies. And I found that the first time I went to Israel, and I was accosted by both Palestinians and Israelis who did nothing but complain loudly about the behavior of the British. And I began to realize that this was not just their conflict, it was our conflict too. We were bound up in this, and I'm sure you can say that the United States, which stepped into our shoes when we faded out as a world power, can say the same. So what we have to understand that we are implicated in all of this. And as we sit here in Chautauqua, let us sometimes let the pain in. Let that pain in as we sit. Let it disturb us. We're creating with the Charter a network of compassionate cities worldwide. There are now over 200 of them. And someone once asked me in an interview, what should a compassionate city be like? I said it should be an uncomfortable city. Because the Prophet Muhammad once said, peace be upon him, not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that somebody is hungry. And we have that now vision to see it worldwide. And one of the things that the religions have always taught us, in one way or another, is to look at the pain of the enemy. The violence, lawless violence, nearly always proceeds from pain and fear. And we help to create our enemies. Gandhi once said that he could never make himself hate the British, even though he deplored their colonial policies, because he'd been taught in the Upanishads that every single one of us shares the same sacred core, that we are therefore one, that your enemy is not only not your enemy, he is almost identical with you. And I think we see that a little in the Hebrew scriptures, in the story of Jacob and Esau. They are enemies. And what happens to Esau is awful. He's the loser, but it's awful. God hasn't chosen him. And what I love about Genesis, what is so wonderful about it, is that it doesn't whitewash the pain of life. When Jacob steals his birthright Esau's cry is devastating. Have you no blessing for me, Father? He cries. Father, bless me too. And of course he cannot. But Jacob and Esau, all their life, they were wrestling in their mother's womb. And we're told that Esau stands for Edom, one of Israel's neighbors and enemies, that they were fighting in their mother's womb. They cannot live with one another or without one another. They are twins. When they look into each other's eyes, they see themselves as in a mirror. And we tend to grow into the image and likeness of our enemy as we meditate on his bad qualities, often presenting them to ourselves as the opposite of us. And in the ancient world, twins were often seen as two halves of a single whole. So what should religion be bringing to the global scene? We know what some Bowdlerized forms of it are bringing to the scene, but what should those of us in the pews who have no intention of committing a terrorist act be bringing to the scene? Should we be bringing anything at all? We've been told that religion should be kept out of the political sphere, a new development. I'd suggest we should be bringing some of these questions. Who is my brother? Consider the pain of the enemy, our enemies. And above all, the practice of the Golden Rule, what's often called the Golden Rule. Confucius is one of the first people to formulate this, but it's been developed in every major tradition that I'm aware of, quite independently, showing that it speaks to something in the structure of our humanity. A translation of Confucius: never impose upon others what you would not desire for yourself. Now, if we British had observed that in our colonies, I'm pretty certain we wouldn't be having so many political problems today. And they all insist that we cannot confine our compassion to our own group, our own congenial friends or allies, or people we like. We have to have what another Chinese sage says, called yan ai, concern for everybody. And that too we must extend our sympathies to the ends of the earth. The people who formulated the Golden Rule were not living in societies like Chautauqua, peaceful, calm, full of prayer and contemplation and learning. They were living in societies that had reached an explosion of violence on an unprecedented scale. And Mozu, the sage who promoted the Yan Ai, said that unless we did that, human beings would destroy each other. And that, with the weaponry that we have created, has never been more true than today. It now seems to me imperative that unless we learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, so that we treat all peoples, whoever they are, whether we like them or not, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world will not be a viable place. What causes violence? It's not just that someone picks up a copy of the Quran and then rushes out immediately to bomb a London bus. We are violent people. We have violence written into the deepest recess of our brain. I think I've spoken about this before. We inherited from our reptilian ancestors 4 instinctive drives that were absolutely essential for the survival of our species. The drive to fight for territory, for space, to flee if necessary, for food, they often called the 4 Fs, and to propagate one's genes, reproduction. And these drives are instinctive and very, very strong, and when the fear mechanism is raised, then you're going to get violence on the sort that we have today. But at the same time, it seems fairly well established that we have also a strong taboo against killing our own kind. That's a handy evolutionary strategy too, because it's not smart to kill members of a struggling species. And after World War II, an extraordinary survey was done of a huge number of US infantrymen who had fought in Europe and the Pacific. And they found, to their amazement, that only 25% of them were able to fire directly at the enemy. The others developed complicated methods of reloading their machine or misfiring so as to avoid detection. Because it is deeply ingrained. That disappears, however, when your enemy becomes invisible. When you're flying way above the clouds and we can't see the devastation that we're causing, or when we send out a drone. But at the same time, we are also hardwired for empathy too, especially for our own kind. And it was that enabled the mammals who developed certain brain systems about 120 million years ago, that enabled sentient beings for the first time to look after their young, to look after beings other than themselves instead of just being guided by me first. Now, for quite the longest period of our history, when we were hunter-gatherers in what we often call the prehistoric period, we were professional killers. Before the invention of agriculture, we depended upon the slaughter and killing of animals much larger and more powerful than ourselves, which we were able to kill because we have big brains and we developed a technology that enabled us to do this. And these hunting bands were the seeds of our modern armies. Yet, even though they would have fought among themselves in the tribes, but it seems quite certain that they did not go to war with one another. Certainly there would be skirmishes from time to time, but war, as we know it, organized violence, demands resources, organization, and sustained leadership, which was way beyond the capacity of these small groups. War comes only with civilization. It's only about 5,000 years old. Hence, we've got a very complicated relationship to war because it's new in our history. Everything, and yet at the same time, as we can sense perhaps in the caves of Lascaux, there was a reluctance to kill these beasts whom they honor in these numerous wall paintings, some 17,000 years old, one of the oldest documents of our species. Today, we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies, they've created rituals to somehow assuage this sense of guilt that they feel in killing their fellow creatures. One of the things, too, that is interesting is that modern hunter-gatherer societies are egalitarian. They have to be. It's not possible for a small group like that, for a few people to commandeer most of the wealth and suppress the rest. Nor can they rule by coercion, because all hunters have the same weapons and the same fighting skills. And because this was the longest period of our history, we've inherited this fundamental belief that we should live together as equals. It's persisted stubbornly, even though in our civilizations we've never been able to achieve conditions of equality. And you have that. This has been a goal in the religious life. In yoga, the goal of yoga is not to lose weight or become more flexible, nor is it to become calm and peaceful. It is to achieve a state that they call equanimity, where you cannot see any other human being as lesser than yourself, that you see all as equal and on a par. The Jains in particular have been crucial in helping practitioners to see and appreciate a world in pain, and to determine not to harm a single creature, even the smallest microbe, to make themselves aware of the vulnerability of their fellow beings. The early Buddhists devised a prayer which could be said by lay people as well as practitioners. It says, "Let all beings be happy, rich or poor, of high, middle or low estate, alive or still to be born, may they all be perfectly happy." Sending compassion and thoughts of fellow feeling to every creature on the planet, not omitting a single one, even a mosquito, from their radius of concern. And without achieving this, there was no enlightenment. So we are torn creatures. We're torn. We've got different impulses in our brains that incline us to empathy, that incline us to violence. And consequently, our scriptures are also torn. They're contradictory because just like ourselves. In the Hebrew Bible, we read in the book of Deuteronomy that God wants the Israelites to kill all the native inhabitants of Canaan, to wipe them out entirely, make no treaties with them. And yet, reflecting on exactly the same stories, reflecting on, you have a priestly aristocracy at a later stage, a priestly aristocracy who'd been through the trauma of exile in Babylon, who'd been through, who were living in Judea, which at that time was an extremely violent place, urging their fellow Israelites to honor the stranger living in their midst. There were a lot of uprooted people who'd been plonked there by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. There was tension. If a stranger lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourselves, because you were strangers in Egypt. It's the golden rule, the mechanism of the golden rule. Look into your past. Discover what gave you pain in Egypt, and then refuse under any circumstance to inflict that pain on the strangers in your midst today. In the New Testament, we have, in the book of Revelation, we have Jesus riding into battle on a white horse to slaughter the enemy. And yet Jesus said to love your enemies in another gospel. Another, again, a torn and divided scripture. And that command to love, he was probably referring to the Hebrew chesed, which means loyalty. He wasn't talking about feeling warm affection. Emotion is neither here nor there, but a principled determination to treat others as you would treat yourself, to offer people, as two kings in the ancient Near East would often promise to love each other and become allies, which meant that they would give each other practical help and support and come to their aid in time of trouble. And that's the kind of love we have to give to our so-called enemies today. And jihad, sometimes listening to people, you'd think that the whole of the Quran was dedicated to jihad. In fact, the word jihad and its derivatives occurs only 44 times in the Quran. And in only 10 of those cases does it apply unequivocally to warfare. The word jihad means struggle, which means that you have to struggle to do the will of God and to create a just and decent society. And that means sharing your food even when you have nothing yourselves. That's a jihad, as well as fighting, which is also, can be a jihad. So you have, again, you have commandments to war, and you have commandments to peace and reconciliation. Torn scriptures, just like the other two. Now, warfare comes with civilization, as I said. The earliest form of civilization was based on agriculture. Now, often we look back on the agricultural age as a sort of idyllic time, perhaps not unlike Chautauqua, with happy peasants tilling the fields, living close to nature, in harmony with the seasons, in an unpolluted world. But it was a very cruel civilization. Agrarian civilization depended upon a basic injustice. And it also depended on warfare. Let me come to the warfare first. Because the only way to increase your gross national product was to acquire more farming land, more arable land, and more peasants to farm it, warfare was absolutely essential to the economy. And so was plunder. And so warfare was always part of this. Now, because there were a number of people fighting for the same scarce resources, warfare could become endemic. And it was discovered eventually by trial and error that paradoxically the only way to achieve peace was to keep these different warring peoples down with a huge hegemonic power, the empire. And the empire, for all its injustice, was seen, paradoxical as it seemed to us, as the best way of keeping the peace. Augustus was hailed as the Son of God and the Savior when he became sole ruler and emperor of Rome, because he brought peace to the world after a century of warfare. And of course, the people who suffered most in warfare were always the poor, and who died in droves as the armies rode over their territories, killing and burning their livestock, and later of disease. Now, there's another form of violence too, and it has been called by the World Council of Churches structural violence. And it occurs when one group takes the resources of society and uses it for its own purposes rather than for the good of the whole, thus forcing other people to live against their will in subjection. Now, in any agrarian society, whether this was in the Middle East or India or Africa or Europe, China, a small aristocracy comprising much more than 2% of the population, with the aid of retainers, would subjugate 90% of people and force them to live at subsistence level, taking their agricultural surplus away from them. And no culture, until the modern period when agriculture ceased to be the mainstay of the economy, was ever able to find an alternative. But sociologists of religion, of history, tell us that without this iniquitous system, we would probably never have advanced beyond subsistence level as a species, because we'd have just eaten our surplus, the population would have expanded, and population growth would have kept pace with productivity. This hideous system created a leisured class which was able to had the leisure to create the arts and the sciences on which progress depended. And as Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk in America, has said, all those of us who have benefited from this are somehow implicated in this injustice. And Jesus made the same point when he said, blessed are the poor. The Greek used there is the destitute. He's saying, blessed are the beggars, because they are the only people not benefiting from this dreadful system. So, and yet, there was always an outcry. The story of Cain and Abel, with which we began. Cain is the first farmer, and he creates the first city. And his grandson, Tubal the smith, creates its weapons. And the biblical author shows you that he regards the agrarian state as a violent, almost criminally violent institution. The dilemma of civilization is summed up in an emperor called Ashoka. He was the first emperor of India, lived in about the 3rd century BC. And he had been horrified while he was on an expedition to see the loss of life. He was a cruel man. He'd come to the throne by killing 2 of his brothers. But he had a conversion when he saw the hideous loss of life that resulted in a battle against a rebellious city. And he was appalled to watch 250 prisoners of war being taken away from their families and used for forced labor in the fields of the empire. And he put up all over India extraordinary inscriptions. When kings usually put up inscriptions, they usually listed the number of people they killed with great jubilation. Ashoka put up on huge rock faces, on massive cylindrical cylinders all over India, inscriptions saying almost the exact opposite. Saying that these were uncovered and translated during the 19th, early 20th century. Saying that he deplored the loss of life, urging kings, if they had to go to war, to do so as little as possible. He urged everybody he said he was going to give up hunting, the violent sport of kings, and go on royal pilgrimages to Buddhist shrines instead. He urged everybody to honor all the teachers, who were even those called heretical by the Brahmins, and he was planted shade trees and founded clinics for the refreshment of animals and humans alike. And yet Ashoka could never disband his army. Because even if he'd retired and become a Buddhist monk, he knew that a whole bunch of other aristocrats would fight to displace him. There'd be warfare again, and the people who would suffer most would be the people he was trying to protect. Nor could he return the 250 deported prisoners of war to their homes because the economy depended upon forced labor. And that is Ashoka's dilemma, is the dilemma of civilization itself. It is recorded in veiled form in the Mahabharata, India's national epic, which looks at the tragic dilemma of the warrior who has to fight to defend his society, because no state can survive without some kind of military army, and yet hates warfare and wishes he could give it up. But there was always an outcry. In the earliest poem, one of the earliest poems ever to come down to us, the gods cry aloud in anger at the structural violence of Mesopotamia in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And they cry out to the head god, Anu, and say, he's trampling on your people. Is this how you think a shepherd should behave to his flock? And the head of the gods shakes his head, no, but he can't change the system. And throughout history, there were those, like the Hebrew prophets, who cried out against the violence and dispossession of the poor and urged justice and compassion. There was always that outcome. Then we come to the industrial age, which replaces agriculture. And so certainly, for many of us, things are much, much better. My forebears would certainly have been peasant labourers in Ireland and would have looked in astonishment at the advantages and privileges that I, a woman, have been fortunate enough to have. And many of you must be able to say the same. But as early as Hard Times by Charles Dickens, written in the 1860s, I think, Dickens saw that industrial society had its own structural injustice. Poor people were no longer conscripted for work in the fields, but into the factories. And Charles Dickens just looks at the industrial city as a kind of inferno, where the laborers are treated in despair. But it also led to colonialism, because to keep productivity going, we had to find new markets for our goods, and hence the invasion of the Middle East, Africa, India, etc. And we have now, alas, a sort of new structural violence, so that here we are in privileged Chautauqua, privileged United States and Britain, where there are people in the world who have no clean water. And this is something that should trouble us. The West and the rest, it's been called. Also, the nation state, which is our new polity. You can say it's become a new absolute, because it has justified an awful lot of killing. But Lord Acton, as early as a British historian of the late 19th century, made some prophetic remarks, especially this one. He said that because the nation, that is the people, were now identified as the supreme value, identified with the state, the government, questions of ethnicity, culture, and language would become crucial. And he feared that people who did not meet those requirements, ethnic minorities, would suffer in the nation state. And we've seen that. We've seen that happen. We've seen that happen in the Holocaust. We've seen that happen in Armenia, in Bosnia. It's the Achilles heel almost. In the old days, in the religiously inspired states, people were hounded for being heretics. And that's one of the things that people always bring about religion. Look how they sort of trounce people because they don't believe the right things, etc. But these heretics, at least in Europe, were never very interested in doctrine. They were crying out against the structural injustice of society and urging for a return, for example, to the spirit of the gospel, which speaks more of equality and love and the golden rule. And now it seems to me that that persisted. It even, in those obscure discussions about the nature and person of Christ in the Eastern Empire, which Western people always think is utterly bizarre and incomprehensible, even these were fueled by the politics of the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, and ambitious clerics who were fighting for episcopal power as energetically and pugnaciously as politicians fight for seats in Congress today. Now, today, we've decided to keep religion out of politics. And this is an utterly new development. Before the modern period, the early modern period, religion permeated all aspects of society. Trying to take religion out of politics would have been like trying to take the gin out of the cocktail. It would have been impossible until about 1700 for anybody to see where religion began and politics ended, so to speak, or the other way around. And this can be a great blessing. First of all, a tradition can easily become violated by being too closely associated with the violence of the state. And this happened in Byzantium, in Christian Rome, where suddenly Jesus, who'd said, you're all eat at the same table, share what you have, give to the poor, don't amass possessions, suddenly you have a Christian emperor and who starts persecuting heretics because they are not towing the imperial line. And so you have a real disconnect there. And it was not customary in the agrarian state. It was for the aristocracy to expect the common people to share their religion. They hardly saw the peasants as the same species. And in ancient Persia, for example, Zoroastrianism was the religion of the aristocracy. And it was strictly prohibited either to proselytize and try and make other people Zoroastrians who weren't Persians, who weren't of the Persian ruling class, or to abscond, because that was treason. And so various religious communities ruled themselves. They had their own officials. And this was the principle taken over by the Muslims, the dhimmi system, when they conquered Persia and conquered that part of the world. But then Islam has a problem too, because here Islam too, it's torn because you have a scripture that speaks of equality, that hates kingship, that speaks of sharing of wealth and not amassing private fortunes. And suddenly they find that in order to keep the peace, they have to have an empire. And this causes great disquiet in Muslim ranks. Many of the enthusiasms and institutions that we associate with Islam today came out of the agonized discussions about how could you mesh the ideals of the Quran with the realities of imperial rule. The Shia emerged. They said no to this, and they created a sort of alternative society that protested against the injustice of the mainstream. The Sufis took up a more ascetic lifestyle in rebellion against the luxury of the imperial court. Jurisprudence, fiqh, developed at that time too, so that to try and get the Quran into a sort of legal system that would keep on plugging the Quranic ideal against the realities of imperial aristocratic rule. It's been a blessing to separate religion and politics. But on the other hand, it goes to say, don't have anything to do with politics at all. I mean, I once had, for example, I was once sitting on a platform with the Dalai Lama in Idaho, as you would do, I think it was September the 14th, some years back. And he gave, the Dalai Lama, he just enthralls everybody. And the day before our session, he had a marvelous session with religious leaders in an interfaith gathering. I was the moderator, and it was fantastic. Some of these people had never been to an interfaith session before, and it was extraordinary. So he went off, and I came down from the podium. I was immediately surrounded by the press, who asked me what I thought of Idaho abolishing church and state by allowing the children out of school to go to the session in the stadium. I'm afraid I said, look, get a life. So if you try and keep, this kind of thing, and I agree you don't want to get caught up with politicians and all that, but where is the outcry against the injustice of the state? This is what I'm saying we should perhaps be bringing to the table. And it goes against the grain of the way religions or the great sages worked. When the Buddha achieved enlightenment, he was tempted to just sit under that Bodhi tree and bask in the wonderful new peace he'd found. And he thought, the inconvenient thought occurred to him that perhaps he should preach this Dhamma, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. It's too much trouble, it'd be depressing. And then Brahma, the god in the highest heaven, came down to earth and knelt before him and said, preach your Dhamma, because the world will be utterly lost if you don't. And he made the Buddha look at the world and see the suffering and the pain. And he went out that very night and started to go out to preach, to help people live with that pain creatively. And he would send his monks not just to sort of do yoga all day long, but to go out into the world and work for the good welfare and suffering of the world. His monastic community, the oldest institution in the world, modeled a more compassionate way for people to live together, where a king came to visit the community and said, "It's nothing like the royal court." He said, there everyone's fighting one another, and even they're all jockeying for position, and even when I'm speaking, they're heckling. He said, but here I look at the monks, they look gentle, composed, and they are looking at one another with the eyes of wild deer. It was an alternative society. We need to build alternative modes of living today to act as a reminder of what needs to be done. Confucius, who developed, as I said, the Golden Rule, was not just doing something private. He was concerned all his life to find a king who would implement the Golden Rule and rule in a humane way. And when he never succeeded in getting a king to do that for him. Never impose on others what you would not like what you would not desire for yourself. And his disciples asked him, Master, which of your teaching should we put into practice all day and every day? And he said that, Shu, likening to the self. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance not to inflict that pain on anyone else. How do you apply this to politics, they asked. It's quite simple, said Confucius. Use your own feelings as a guide to your treatment of others. And here we think of the global world that we are facing. You seek to establish yourself, then seek to establish others. You want to turn your merits to account, then make sure that others have the chance to turn their merits to account. Do not impose on others what you would not desire for yourself. When you move among the common people, behave as if you were in the presence of an important guest. People later sages often blamed Confucius for wasting too much time on the family, but that's not accurate. Confucius said we learned in the family how to live compassionately with people, but what we learned there had to go out in a series of concentric circles, first to your own neighborhood, then to your region, and then to what he called the whole world, which was simply the Chinese plain. Now we have to take that same concentric circles out, moved outside the charmed circle of Chautauqua, the United States or Britain, and reach out and let that pain of the world affect us. In Buddhism, compassion does not mean just feeling sorry for people. It means taking responsibility for the suffering you see in the world and working practically to assuage it. Jesus commands. He is trying to build communities, as he says, where people, rich and poor, will sit at the same table, where debts are forgiven instead of people losing their land. When you have people to a party, he says to his host, don't just invite your rich friends and people you find congenial. No, go out into the highways and byways and bring everybody into the circle. Always treat others as you wish to be treated yourself, he says, with the Golden Rule. And Paul tried to do this in the Greco-Roman world with his communities. The monks of Egypt left imperial Byzantium with its and said, no, we're going off. And their chief concern, they often describe their struggles in this hard life in the desert as a struggle with demons. And we always assume that this was sexual temptations. But these monks were not as obsessed with sex as we are. When they thought of women, They thought of the economic burden they were hoping to escape, and steered clear of them for that reason. But their chief demon was the demon of anger, because Egyptian peasants had hot tempers. And all their lives they fought the demon of anger to empty their mind of hatred and to create a system of hesychia, a peaceful tranquility. But some monks, instead of fighting the demon of anger, gave free rein to the reptilian urges of the brain. They were in Syria, and they were not so happy. Now, I want to end with two very short stories. One is Jacob and Esau, of course, who I mentioned earlier, who saw one another, who eventually were reconciled and saw in each other the face of God. And the other is in Homer's Iliad, where Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, who wants to avenge his friend Patroclus, kills Hector, one of the Trojan princes, and refuses to give the body to the family back to burial. And then one night, King Priam of Troy, Hector's father, comes into the camp. And he is in disguise. He's coming into enemy territory. He comes to Achilles' tent, and he throws off his disguise, and he falls at Achilles' feet, embracing his knees and weeping, pleading for the body of his son. And Achilles looks at the old man, and his heart has been filled with rage and anger, but he remembers his own father, and he begins to weep. And Priam weeps for all the sons, not just Hector, whom Achilles has slain. And the two men weep together. The Greeks believed that to weep together created a bond between people, because everybody has pain. Everybody knows suffering, sorrow, and death. And when they have finished weeping, they look at each other, and Achilles brings Hector's body and lays it in the arms of the old man very tenderly, afraid that the weight will be too great for him. And then the two men look at each other, and Homer tells us each sees the other as a god, as divine. And that is when we do become godlike. That is a chief religious imperative for our torn time, when we learn that our enemies also have pain. Thank you. Yep.
It's been a while since you watered the ivy outside of the United Church of Christ headquarters, but thank you. I apologize for my cell phone to all. Recently, my wife and I participated in a National Geographic study on DNA, and I find that all of us sitting here in this auditorium are descendants of some African people from the Horn of Africa, my ancestors 70,000 years ago. Maybe that's a touchstone for all of us to keep in mind as we work together religiously or politically, that somehow we are all the children of the one God. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can comment more on that particular study or what you think.
Yes, I mean, that is a fantastic study. And I believe only men can trace their ancestry in this way. They haven't yet got the technology, but you can find out how your people came from Africa. And it's something that we should remember, that Africa is often seen as just a problem. An undeveloped region full of, unsophisticated, but that is the home of us all. And so that common thread we share the same DNA, we are related, we are all brothers and sisters of one another. And it is now imperative, it should be a chief imperative that we take these religious ideals of equanimity, of equality, of a sense of relatedness. Where is your brother, Abel? And not simply shrug our shoulders and say, I don't know. These people are our concern. And if we don't treat them with justice, not only do we betray our highest ideals, but we endanger, I think, the survival of our species. Yes?
So for those of us who want to live a natural spiritual life and it feels at odds with the society and structure that we've been born into, but we don't want to fully disconnect and become reclusive. We want to be able to stay connected with people and be able to help people and help us all evolve. What is your advice about how we balance that?
Could you, the acoustics aren't so good. Could you just repeat the first, what is the dilemma? We want to help, but?
It's difficult living in the society that we live in if we want to live a natural spiritual life. Because of, for example, I'm growing up now, I'm in my 20s, and I'm trying to learn about taxes and insurance and all these different things, and it just feels I'm jumping through all these hoops and loops and I want things to be simple.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? Of course we want things to be simple, and we are burdened, you're quite right, by a whole lot of stuff, as you say, like taxation, like social services, etc. But remember that we are lucky to have the money to be taxed at all, to have the resources to be taxed at all. Spirituality is not simple. It's never simple. It's not just a question of sitting. It was not simple in the agrarian age. There was always war. There's always disease. If you were a peasant, you couldn't join the Upanishadic sages and practice yoga. No overseer is going to allow a peasant to sit for hours in the fields every day doing yoga. This was the privilege of the aristocracy. Jesus is unusual in coming from the other side of the tracks. And he's unusual. We don't hear much about that from that side. So I think we just keep in mind the privilege you have. The privilege to be living in a free society where you have the opportunity to explore the spiritual life and the means to do so. And that you're not working in a factory from dawn until dusk until you die an early death. We've got to keep reminding ourselves of our privilege. But keep looking out. I think it's hard for America. You're so cut off by your great oceans from the rest of the world. But we must, I think one good means of improving our spirituality in this technical age is to look at the news every night and look at the images of suffering that pour into our living room night after night. And take one of them, perhaps the image of a child, a desperate child, or a woman who's been raped, or people in a terrible explosion. And instead of pushing it out from, keeping it at bay, as in the Buddha's pleasure park, keep that image with you during the day. Let it trouble you. Let it disturb you. You'll be then extending your sympathies, putting your natural shrinking to one side and opening yourself out to the world's pain. Because all the world faiths put pain right at the top of the agenda. The Christian in the West, in Christianity, we have an image of a man ravaged by human cruelty, a crucifix. And Peter Abelard, the French philosopher, 12th century, said that that he didn't die as just pay a price and save us from our sins in that way. When we look at this man wrecked by human cruelty, we feel immense sorrow and compassion, and it is the act of compassion that saves us. So to keep that going, to remind ourselves of our unutterable privilege, and then try and do something each month, say, to start with, to assuage suffering when you see it. Because it's about doing things, I think. It's not just a question of retreating and meditating. I'm hopeless at meditation. I've never been able to do it. I've been a complete flop. When I was a young nun, I could not meditate. But I found that, by these kinds of methods, that you're putting yourself to one side, getting beyond the me-first drives of the brain, and putting yourself out into the position of people who will break your heart, let your heart be broken. And then you're beginning to feel with the other, which is what compassion is. So make use of our technology too, and the web, because the web is a wonderful instrument, but it can be used to ill effect too, to spread hatred. And, every time I write an article, sometimes about a subject like this, I am inundated with hate mail on the web. People are going to come and burn down my house and all this kind of thing. Let's get some compassionate stuff out there on the web, dilute it a bit, and use it to find out about the plight of other people. Concentrate on a part of the world that you know nothing about. Start looking at meals that they have and their culture and how our society may have interacted with theirs. And then you're beginning to do as the Buddhists do, to extend your sympathies, the concentric circles of Confucius too, going from yourself, your family, into wider and wider circles. And that is breaking down the selfishness that holds us back from enlightenment and from what we call God.
I would just like to hear your reflections or thoughts on how the Chinese Communist Party, or that controls China, how they have exploited Confucian's principles for generations to keep the non-Han minorities down, and the one-child policy. All of those have stemmed in part from the Confucian principles.
Yeah, Confucius, and I didn't get a chance to mention this, Confucius always died feeling he was a failure because he never succeeded in getting a good political post where he could put these principles into practice. But he became, Confucians were at the heart of the civil government of China, bringing a compassionate alternative to the violent policies of the Chinese imperial army and the emperor until the 1911 revolution. And Confucius has been utterly reviled by the communist regimes. And as you say, there's been immense cruelty. But, I was in China a couple of years ago. I went to represent the British Museum at a conference of museums there in Shanghai. And where the other museum heads, our director couldn't go, but the other museum heads were talking about visitor numbers and that kind of thing. I can't do that. So I talked to them about the importance of the museum in public life, about how it enables us to understand other cultures. And I talked to them about Confucius and Mozi. They loved it. They kept on saying, we don't know any of this stuff. And this is marvelous. There are Confucian groups building up, which I haven't had the chance to explore. But certainly the receptivity because the museum was slightly worried that they might feel I was getting at them in some way. But no, at question time, all the questions were about religion. And there is a feeling now that they've lost part of their heritage and want to get back to that. But it is a great sorrow because, of course, as you say, the one-child policy, the ruthlessness with which, like any imperial regime, selfish policies have stamped out that compassionate message.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated the way you presented this topic, this difficult topic. My name is Gerald Neiman. I'm not one to want to return to a more simple or agrarian system, but that's where our moral code comes from, right? 3,000 years ago, this moral code was developed. So do we need a new moral code that reflects the present kind of system that we live under? A new Bible?
Do we need a new moral code?
A new moral code, or rewrite the Bible to fit the kind of a system that we are forced to live under?
Well, I don't think we need to rewrite the Bible. I think that would be a bit of a waste of time. I think that the Bible is as it is, and it is a document that has helped people, and people struggle with it. The thing is, Scripture, it's been very well said, Scripture is not a text, it's an activity. What is Torah, asked the rabbis. It is the interpretation of Torah, they replied. That it's a struggle to bring meaning out of this text. And you do it, it's something peculiar with us human beings. We take a text, like the Bible, like the Quran, like your Constitution, developed in another age, and make it the center of our lives and the center of us. And it's a constant struggle to constantly reinterpret it. But I don't see how you can improve on the ethic of the Golden Rule myself. And that if we stick to that and try and find practical, realistic, and creative ways of implementing it in the flawed and tragic conditions of our time, then I think we've got our work cut out, really. Because often we don't need to rewrite these texts. That speaks a lot to people still flock to see the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu because they recognize that that kind of humanity is how we are supposed to be. And we recognize that that is essential for us. But it won't just work unless we work at it. And if we could just stop fussing about evolution and various sort of ethical or sexual problems and all these and constant. Why did I start the Charter of Compassion? Because you rarely heard about it. When religious people got together, they were often just condemning something or, defining a doctrine or something. Let's get to the heart of that golden rule, because that is what our world requires now. To see all others as our absolute equals, and to see all creatures on this endangered planet as our equals, treat them with reverence. Walk among the common people, said Confucius, where most aristocrats thought of the common people of China as animals. Walk among them as if you were in the presence of an important guest. And I think there's so much in all our scriptures that teach us that lesson. Abraham meeting taking three strangers, complete strangers, into his encampment, strangers who could possibly kill him. How many of us would bring three strangers off the street into our own home, and giving them an elaborate meal and finding that God is somehow present in the conversation? Genesis 18, and that divine encounter, and it leads to a divine encounter. Luke, it tells the story of Jesus, the road to Emmaus, where the disciples speak two strangers open their hearts to him and let him change their faith. And then they get a glimpse of Jesus, the risen Jesus, that it's by reaching out to the stranger, by studying the scriptures together creatively, not just clinging to the past as if to a life jacket, but creatively reading your scriptures together and eating together as the disciples ate with this stranger, with sitting together at the same table. We have to learn to sit at the same table with everybody in our world. Make sure we need a global democracy where all people's voices are heard, not just those of the rich and the powerful. Yes, this is the last one, I'm afraid.
I have, after years of contemplation, come to the conclusion that religion, no matter how noble in conception and creation, will always lead to violence, because whether it takes 200 years or it takes 2,000 years, there will be someone who misinterprets the religion, or someone who uses that religion as a justification for hatred. And so my question to you is, am I just being too pessimistic, or is there really no way that we, as our deeply flawed human species, can, have our cake and eat it too with regards to religion? Can we have religion and have it be a central part of our lives without any of us abusing it?
Well, we have, as a species, we have a genius for fouling things up. Whatever we do, we can ruin it, whether that's a religious tradition or a political ideal. Politics also. But we can't live without politics, unfortunately. It's almost impossible to live now outside the purlieus of a state. And the state, as I've said, always brings injustice. Your question, it's not so much pessimistic as modern. It's seeing religion as something separate from all other activities, associated with a supernatural God and a coherent body of doctrines, beliefs, and ethical practices. No other culture, including pre-modern Europe, had anything like that concept of religion. Religion wasn't, it's all in my new book, religion wasn't a sort of an objective something. It permeated everything. And in the last 50 years or so, we've found that it is in the academy that it's impossible to define religion in that way. We did that in the 17th century. Locke and people said, we're separating religion and politics, and your founding fathers did too. But they assumed that there had been societies in the past which had separated in religion and politics before. No. Religion permeated everything. The words that we translate as religion in other languages bear no relation to this. Deen in Arabic means an entire way of life. Dharma refers to legal, judicial, political, and economic affairs, not just to religion. The rabbis would have been bewildered by the idea of religion as something separate from ordinary life. In the Talmud, they were concerned to bring the whole of life into the ambit of the sacred. Tawheed in the Muslim ideal of Tawheed, which means integration, making all things one. So to see religion as something separate, like a sort of chemical or something that when we drop it into politics, it goes boom, this is what we were taught. And it's been called the myth of religious violence. But it is a myth in the bad sense of the word, in that it's a fiction. Because it has and by demonizing religion in this way, we have sometimes damaged it and pushed it into a sort of either a selfishness where people just spend their time praying or worrying about these abstruse doctrines instead of the plight of the poor and the needy, which is what our scriptures all tell us to do. And I feel a looming nemesis at my left. But thank you for your question.